Small details sometimes matter when writing Chinese characters, but sometimes they don't. Figuring out which details to pay attention to is made harder by character variants and font differences. Hello and welcome to the Hacking Chinese podcast. In this week's episode, we are going to talk about character variants and font differences, and we're going to do so from a learner perspective. So, in other words, we're going to discuss what these things are and how they affect you as a student of Chinese. This is not meant to be a technical discussion about the ins and outs of displaying Chinese characters on digital devices, but instead we're going to focus on things you need to pay attention to or at least be aware of as a student. In this episode, I'm going to discuss Chinese characters, how they are written and how they are displayed, which is tricky to do in an audio-only format. So if you want a written article, there is one on Hacking Chinese, where there are plenty of examples where I've also highlighted the differences between different standards, different fonts, variants, and so on. However, I will do my best to make sure that you as a listener can still follow even if you are not looking at the article while doing so. First, let's talk about my first encounter with different character standards and font variations. So, when I started learning Chinese, I accidentally used a Japanese font for my flashcards. And in most cases, this is not a problem because the characters look exactly the same. And that means that as a beginner, it took me a while before I realized that I was using the incorrect font. The character that made me realize that something was wrong is zhi, as in straight, including all compounds that this character appears in, and this one is written differently in Chinese Standard and Japanese Standard. In Japanese Standard, this is written with an L shape at the bottom, whereas in Chinese it is a horizontal stroke with two dots below it. You don't need to be able to visualize what the Japanese version looks like to follow the argument here, but the point is that I did not realize that this was a problem when I studied the flashcards. I only figured out what was wrong when my teacher pointed out that I was writing this character incorrectly, whereupon I looked at the flashcard, compared it with the font used in our textbook, and realized that these are not the same. You don't need to use a Japanese font to get these differences, however, because there are many different ways of displaying Chinese characters if we stay within the Chinese language. So, for example, it can vary over time. It used to be written in one way and now it's not. Or it can differ by region, so one version is standard in Hong Kong or Taiwan and a different one in mainland China. In the written article, I brought up several examples, and you can see if you can spot the differences or if you know which one is standard where. Here, I'll just bring up one example that I think most listeners will be able to relate to, and that is the first character in Gutou, bone, so the Gu bit. And in mainland China, the little box inside of the big box is written on the left, whereas in Taiwan, for example, the little box at the top is written on the right. There is actually another difference in this character, and that is for the component rou, which in mainland China is written exactly as moon with two horizontal strokes, but in Taiwan these strokes are tilted, making it different from moon, and therefore you can see that it's rou and not yue, whereas in the mainland version you cannot, they are identical. So in this episode I want to discuss this type of difference and how to deal with it as a learner of Chinese. It's important to realize that these characters are the same character, although written slightly differently. We're not talking about separate characters here. And it's not a matter of simplified and traditional Chinese either, because if you take a character like Gu that I just mentioned, it will not show up in any list of simplified traditional characters. It is the same character, it's considered the same, it's just that one variant is preferred in mainland China and one is preferred in Taiwan. In the character course I designed for Skritter, I said it is as if they were wearing different clothes, so it's the same character, just displayed or rendered slightly differently. If you want to know more about that course, you can check out the link in the show notes. Now, there is a very large number of differences like these that are not related to simplified traditional, but yet are distinctly different. But the goal here is clearly not to go through all of them. That would be hard to do in audio, but it's not even the goal in the written article on Hacking Chinese. Instead, it is to bring awareness, because these types of differences can troll you quite a lot as a student before you realize what's going on. For example, I lost several points on different Tingxie dictation exams because I used the wrong font before I figured out that that was an issue. It should be pointed out, though, that if communication is your main goal, which variant you use here almost never matters. Chinese people are used to reading different people's handwriting, seeing different fonts and so on, and most people probably won't even notice if you use a different variant. Yes, it's true that if you have an exam and you have a teacher who checks specifically for how you write characters, they will be able to see these differences, but if you're just after communicating with people, that is rarely an issue. To get a better idea of what's going on here, I think it might help to look at an example closer to home, namely in the Latin alphabet and how we write English. You might have noticed that we have two different ways of writing the letter G. Most people, when they write by hand, write a circle and then they go down and have a little hook on it. But when it's printed, it usually has a circle at the top, the same, but then the little hook starts on the left, goes over to the right, and there's a little circle added, not just a hook. And these two are clearly still the same letter, they are both G's, and you might not notice which one a certain person uses if you don't pay attention. The same is true for the letter A, which most people will just write as a circle with an added little leg on the right, but in print it is written with a little hook at the top and then a circle, then the little leg. There's an extra bit at the top, which most people don't write when they write by hand. Still, for people who are used to reading the Latin alphabet, these are clearly the same letters, even though they look quite different graphically. In addition to this, we also have a capital A, which is also A, just again written differently. Although that is a slightly different case, as the capital A has a different function and you only write it at the beginning of sentences or when using names and so on. The point is that you can imagine someone learning the Latin alphabet and then seeing these different variants of A, and it's not immediately obvious that these three variants are in fact the same letter. For example, it could be argued that the handwritten A is actually closer to an O than it is to the other type of A, and this is something, if you've never read these letters, you need to get used to. And so this is exactly what happens in Chinese. The difference is that we don't just have an alphabet with letters, we have thousands of characters, and that means that there is a lot more room for confusion and different variants. This is called allography and can then be rather confusing when learning Chinese characters. The problem is that these differences are not very important, yet you will encounter them all the time, but then there are small differences between characters that are very important and that actually are different characters, not just the same character wearing different clothes. I think the best example of this is the difference between yi, as in 已经, and the ji in 自己. And so in the first case, yi, the third stroke starts a little bit above the point where the second stroke starts, but in ji it starts at the same spot, and so the difference here is just where one of the strokes starts, and the difference can be minimal, yet this difference is very significant because it is the difference between these two characters. They have different pronunciation and different meanings, they just happen to look similar. I've split the remaining discussion about this topic into two different categories, and the first one is regional font differences, and that is then different ways of displaying the same character essentially, and the second is regionally preferred variants, which is when different regions have picked different versions of the same character, and these might sound the same, but I'll explain how they are different in a bit. So let's start with regional font differences in Chinese, and so this is that we have fonts in, for example, Taiwan and mainland China that display certain characters differently, and we talked about the gutou before, the character in bone, and so that has the box on the left or the right, and the horizontal strokes either are slanted or not. What these regional font differences have in common is that from a code perspective, from the computer's point of view, they are the same characters. They have the same code point in Unicode, which means that there is no way for the computer to tell which one it is. It is entirely determined by the font that you use. If you then pick a font issued by the Ministry of Education in China, you will have characters that are displayed in one way, and if you take exactly the same text and you switch to a font issued by the Ministry of Education of Taiwan, it will be displayed differently. So for example, in gutou, the box will move to the right and the horizontal strokes will be tilted. As mentioned before, if you write the wrong version here, either by hand or if you select a font that is not aligned with the region you are in, people will generally not even notice if they're reading a large chunk of text, and it is not very important for communicative purposes, but when you're reading as a student, this can still be confusing, and I remember being tripped up by this as a student myself. Naturally, there is also a lot of variation between different fonts in Chinese in general, and I mean not specifically for a certain region, as is the case with fonts in any language. This shouldn't come as a surprise, and most people notice this immediately, because the font used in your textbook is probably different from the one used on your phone, and then when your teacher writes on the blackboard, obviously they don't write exactly like the font in your textbook or the way the characters are displayed on your phone. This is not what I'm talking about here, though. This is when there are systematic differences between how the characters are displayed in different regions. So to summarize, these font differences are then identical from the point of view of the computer, and the only thing that determines how they look is which font is being used. The second category, which is regionally preferred variants of Chinese characters, is different in the sense that they are different characters. They have different code points in Unicode, and that means that a font can display them differently. In other words, it's not entirely up to the font how these are displayed, but you as a user or the person who wrote the text can type different characters and they will appear differently, or at least they can appear different. To illustrate this, we have the character Hu, as in Chuanghu, for example. And this character actually has 3 different code points in Unicode, which means that a font can display these in 3 distinct ways, even though it is the same character. It has the same pronunciation, it means the same thing, it has the same origins, but you can still display them in 3 different ways. As I mentioned before, it is a little bit tricky to talk about these differences in an audio-only podcast, but if you think of the character in Chuanghu, it consists of a single leaf door with a dot on top. But how is this written? Well, in mainland China, it's usually written with a dot and then this single leaf door. But in Taiwan, this is written differently. We have not a dot at the top, but rather a leftward falling stroke that is then joined with the rest of the door, as it were. Then in Japan, we have a third version, which has a horizontal stroke at the top instead of the dot, and this stroke is not connected to the rest of the character. So these 3 are 3 variants of the same character. Like I said, they have the same pronunciation, they have the same meaning, they are essentially the same as the font differences I talked about earlier. But for some reason, they have different code points in Unicode, which means that you can type them differently. So many fonts that you will see actually can display these 3 differently. And if you look at the written article on Hacking Chinese, you can see what font you use and if it can indeed display these separately. With the font that I'm using, the 3 are displayed differently, which is then not possible for the earlier type of difference that we talked about, such as with Gutao. That means then that if you've written a text with one of these variants, it's not just a matter of changing font to another one and everything will just work. Just as if you write, for example, simplified and traditional characters, simply changing the font will not fix all the differences, because they are indeed considered to be different characters from the computer's point of view. In this case, though, it's not about traditional simplified, because, as I said, none of these show up in any list of simplified characters. If you want a longer, although not comprehensive list of different character variants that are different from the computer's point of view, but still are considered the same character, you can look at the written article on Hacking Chinese. Rather confusingly, some of the variants that have different code points, such as the Hu we have been talking about here, actually don't have parallel versions when they appear in compounds. So for example, I just said that Hu has 3 different versions that can be displayed in 3 different ways by the same font, but when it appears in compounds, there is only one version. So for example, we have Fang, as in Fangzi, house, and that Fang contains this component, but there is only one code point. So that means you cannot display this using the 3 different Hu using the same font. There has to be only one. This can be exceedingly annoying for people who design apps for learning Chinese, because while you can make sure that people get the right version of Hu, it is very difficult to make sure they get the right version of Fang, because that is entirely determined by the font, and you can only choose to use one of them if you have only one font. If you have been learning Chinese for a while, you have probably encountered Chinese character variants a lot, and when you're out in the real world reading Chinese, you will see these all over the place. And some of them look fairly similar. I think most people will be able to figure out that the 3 Hu here are indeed the same character, but there are character variants that look more different than that. Before you complain too much about this as a learner, it's worth noting that Chinese characters have been around for thousands of years and used by a myriad of people, and it's only natural that there are different ways of writing the same thing, and that standardization, and namely choosing which variant to use, is a fairly recent thing. If you want to look up different character variants, there are excellent resources online for free, and I've linked to one of them in the written article on Hacking Chinese. For example, you can see all the different versions of the character zhi that I mentioned before, the one meaning straight, And there are 21 versions, and some of them look nothing like the character we're used to being standard today. If you want to look up which variant is the standard in a specific region, or if you want to compare them, I've also linked to a tool where you can check this for all the common characters. So for example, if you look up zhi, you can see that the standard for this character is in fact the same in mainland China, in Hong Kong, and in Taiwan, but it's different in Japan and in Korea. Funnily enough, you can also see the second round of simplifications, the one that wasn't implemented in mainland China, and see how this character would have looked like if that reform had taken place. This brings us to the end of this episode, and as I mentioned initially, the goal here was not to give you all the examples or list ways that, say, Taiwanese standard differs from Hong Kong standard or something like that. The goal was to bring awareness of this issue, because if you've never seen this and you're worried about writing the right thing, or if you're curious about why characters are displayed differently, even though they seem to be the same characters, this is why that happens. I realize that this episode might have created more questions than it answered, but that is often the case when digging deeper into Chinese characters and realizing that there's a whole world you didn't know about. And I'm not saying you need to dig all the way down, that it would take a PhD and a lifetime of dedication to character variants and different ways of writing Chinese characters, but I am saying that it is worthwhile to know some of the basics about these things so that when you encounter characters that are written differently, or when somebody points out that you've written something differently from what they preferred you to write, or something like that, at least you have some clue of what's going on. I'm sure the audio-only format of this episode has given rise to some extra questions, but then again, you can always head over to the written article on Hacking Chinese, where, as I mentioned, I have displayed different characters, highlighted the differences so that they are easier to see. I have also provided a lot of links where you can read more about this if you really want to dig deeper, and I'll make sure to include these in the show notes as well. So finally, if characters keep confusing you, even though you thought you knew a thing or two about them, that is perfectly fine. There is a lifetime of knowledge here to absorb, and this is one of the things that makes Chinese characters a little bit tricky to get into as a beginner. Before you realize which differences are important to pay attention to, because they are the difference then between two different characters, such as ji and yi, and which differences are simply a matter of preference. Thank you for tuning in to the Hacking Chinese podcast. If you like this episode, please share it. More information and inspiration about learning and teaching Chinese can be found at hackingchinese.com. See you in the next episode, and until then, good luck with your studies.